On the outskirts of Caen, west of a vital city still in German hands, lay the most heavily defended airfield in all of France. Protected by trenches, bunkers, and the elite SS Panzergrenadiers, Carpiquet was surrounded by miles of open terrain, offering no refuge to potential attackers. For weeks after the Normandy landings, the airfield and its nearby village resisted every attempt to breach it, its northern hangars standing defiant against Allied pressure. But by mid-morning on July 4th, 1944, smoke hung heavy over the battlefield, the air vibrating with the roar of artillery and rocket fire. In the distance, Canadian forces pressed forward toward the northern hangars, the key to the airfield's defenses finally within reach. Carpiquet was on the brink of falling. The importance of Carpiquet. The airfield at Carpiquet, spanning a 1 square mile area on the outskirts of the city of Caen in northern France, began as a quiet project in the late 1930s, a French effort to bolster their booming aviation infrastructure. But by the time it opened in August 1939, World War II was already in full swing, and less than a year later, Carpiquet had fallen into the hands of the German forces. Soon, the once small airfield was transformed into a powerful launch site, with much longer runways and more hangars than ever before. Carpiquet became a staging ground for bombing runs over the continent, launching up to 4 missions a day during the height of the terrifying Battle of Britain in 1940. 4 years later, on June 6, 1944, the Allies launched the largest amphibious invasion in history with a massive, coordinated assault on the beaches of Normandy. Throughout the day, the air roared with the sound of bombers and gliders, and the coast of the Atlantic Sea churned under the weight of heavy landing craft, carrying thousands upon thousands of soldiers. As one of the many objectives marked on the Allied maps for the British and Canadian troops landing on the Sword and Juno beaches. Both Carpiquet and the nearby city of Caen represented critical gateways toward the heart of France. By June 7th, the second day of the invasion, the Canadian 9th Brigade was on the move. The unit, once held carefully in reserve during the landings, pushed inland with explicit orders to advance toward Carpiquet, their path leading them through a patchwork of villages and farmland. Moving with urgency, infantry and armored units alike made their way through enemy-held territory. By midday, the Canadians were so tantalizingly close to the airfield that its runways were visible in the distance. However, their momentum was shattered near the village of Autier, when, without warning, the Canadians walked into a German ambush orchestrated by Kurt Meyer, a fearsome tactician and commander of the legendary 12th SS Panzerdivision Hitlerjugend. The leader's forces, comprised of hardened veterans and fiercely loyal youth soldiers alike, sent anti-tank weapons tearing right into Allied armor, while their infantry machine guns and mortars rained destruction on the heavily exposed column. As the battlefield dissolved into chaos, Canadian soldiers scrambled for cover, pinned down by the ferocious German counterfire. By nightfall, the men had been forced into a retreat, their losses heavy, and the once close airfield remained firmly in German hands. But the Allies were not ready to give up this vital airfield just yet. The most defended airfield in all of France. Following the failed June operations, it would take nearly a month before Canadian forces were in a position to launch another attack on Carpiquet. In the meantime, the German defenders transformed the airfield and the surrounding village into an outright fortress. The airfield's defenses included 6 powerful 75mm cannons encased in reinforced steel, and concrete turrets that overlooked the surrounding terrain. 12 anti-aircraft guns, including some fearsome 88mm guns, formed an unyielding ring of protection around the hangars. 2 large concrete bunkers with thick walls guarded critical equipment and troops, while machine guns covered the open ground and choke points, leaving no possible approach unguarded. While the wheat fields around the airfield seemed calm under the French summer sun, beneath the surface was a carefully woven web of traps waiting to spring. At every step, there was danger, ranging from barbed wire and hidden landmines to anti-tank obstacles. But that's not to say the defenders of Carpiquet only relied on their weaponry. A network of trenches snaked across the area, giving the Germans protected positions to fire. A series of hidden tunnels allowed the defenders to move unseen, while telephone lines connected key positions, ensuring the defenders could coordinate their efforts. The men defending Carpiquet were among the most experienced German forces in Normandy. Wilhelm Mohnke's 26th SS Panzergrenadier Regiment held the village and airfield, while Albert Frey's 1st SS Panzergrenadier Regiment secured the approaches from nearby Etterville. On the western edge, Troops from the 1st SS Panzerdivision, Liebstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, fortified their positions, with others taking cover inside the hangars. Reinforcements included a company of Panther tanks and 5 Panzer IVs. Every soldier, every weapon, every defensive measure, there for a single purpose only: to hold Carpiquet at all costs. Operation Windsor. The crucial task of capturing Carpiquet and its airfield, Operation Windsor, was handed to Brigadier Kenneth G. Blackadder's 8th Canadian Infantry Brigade, reinforced by the battle-tested Royal Winnipeg Rifles, part of the first wave to land on Juno Beach. Supporting these brave men were Sherman tanks from the Fort Garry Horse and Sherbrooke Fusiliers, along with specialized armored vehicle Royal Engineers tanks, all equipped with flails for clearing mines and demolition charges to breach fortifications. Before dawn on July 4th, the assault on Carpiquet began with colossal artillery and naval bombardment, including 21 field batteries, totaling 248 guns of varying calibers, thundering into action in the early morning hours, blanketing German defenses with unrelenting fire. A little more than a dozen miles away in the English Channel, the ships HMS Rodney and HMS Roberts joined the barrage. Their 408mm and 380mm guns fired shells that slammed into the village and airfield with earth-shaking force. High above, 2 squadrons of Hawker Typhoon ground attack aircraft lit up the morning sky with the glow of their explosions, making the ground tremble under the weight of the onslaught. While the barrage certainly damaged the battlefield, it did not mean the dangers were over. Now, with Operation Windsor about to begin, more than a mile of exposed country stretched before the advancing infantry. Overtaking Carpiquet. As the clock struck 5 a.m. on July 4th, the Royal Winnipeg Rifles were the first to move forward to probe the southern defenses near the airfield hangars, advancing under the cover of the artillery. Entrenched, well-rested, and prepared, the defenders opened fire, rapidly halting the Canadians' advance and forcing them back after a punishing fight. Only a 90-minute rest later, the artillery barrage resumed, louder and more concentrated than before. This time, under its cover, the Régiment de la Chaudière and North Shore Regiment surged forward toward the village, the ground trembling beneath their boots as they pressed on through open fields, explosions tearing apart enemy fortifications, and tanks rolling steadily behind the infantry. To the north, the Sherbrooke Fusiliers broke through minefields, their tracks crushing the ground. The counterfire was brutal, with shells and machine gun bursts hammering their positions, but the Fusiliers dealt a heavy blow before finally withdrawing under the weight of the defenders' response. Once inside the village of Carpiquet, the battle turned into a bitter, close-quarters brawl. Despite running dangerously low on ammunition, the 12th SS Panzergrenadiers refused to yield, fighting with the Canadian infantry from room to room and barricade to barricade. The determined advancing infantry cleared buildings with rifles, grenades, and their own hands, while medium tanks supported the push, making the German strongpoints fall one by one. By 8:30 a.m., the once lively streets of Carpiquet bore the scars of their advance, with shattered walls, burning debris, and charred materials all around. Finally, the village was in Canadian hands. Though the attackers stood victorious, their gaze now shifted toward the next challenge, the airfield ahead. Afternoon of hell. The Canadian attackers barely had time to catch their breath. By mid-morning, the next phase of Operation Windsor, to push forward and take the airfield and its hangars, was already in motion. With this, the battered but undeterred Royal Winnipeg Rifles moved out once more, supported by the rumbling advance of the Fort Garry Horse tanks. Across the flat, open ground that stretched all the way to the airfield, the Canadians knew every step forward meant braving German mortar fire and well-placed machine guns. The battlefield erupted once more with the defenders' fire. For 90 grueling minutes, explosions ripped through the advancing lines as the Canadians pressed on, crawling, running, and stumbling across the 1.5-mile-long, unforgiving terrain as best they could, the hangars looming ever closer. The entrenched Germans responded with precision. Confusion rippled through the advancing Canadians. Burning tanks, the acrid scent of fuel, and scorched metal filled the battlefield as the assault lost momentum, making some troops fall back, shaken and disorganized. For a brief moment, it seemed the advance might collapse entirely. But the Germans, entrenched and wary, held their positions, choosing not to push forward, a grave hesitation that bought the attackers precious moments to regroup. Suddenly, the roar of Typhoon aircraft filled the sky and the men's hopes alike as the rocket-firing squadrons tore into the airfield, hammering the German defenses. More determined than ever, the Winnipeg rifles and tanks surged forward once more, finally reaching the northern hangars and fighting their way inside, driving the defenders back. SS defenders launched fierce counterattacks from the southern hangars, sending their Panther tanks head-on toward the Canadian tanks. Despite quickly overwhelming the German vehicles, 13 Canadian tanks were lost in the chaos. Nonetheless, the attackers held their ground, finally consolidating their grip on the northern hangars, even as the southern end of the airfield remained contested. As the sun set on July 4th, the Canadians had paid a staggering price, with hundreds of casualties. Yet their foothold at Carpiquet village stood firm. While battles raged across Normandy, it was here, on this battle-soaked ground, that the Allies had pushed closest to Caen. Payback time. As night fell, Kurt Meyer rallied his forces for a bold counteroffensive to retake Carpiquet village, a position he and the Führer considered critical for the defense of Caen. Through the inky black night, German forces assembled as many tanks, artillery, mortars, and heavy machine guns as possible to launch an assault. Just after midnight, the silent night was broken with explosions and gunfire. The Canadian defenders braced against the onslaught as wave after wave of German troops surged forward, stretching into the early hours of July 5th. Despite 3 large separate attacks, each was met with steadfast resistance. In every single charge, the Canadians pushed back harder, leaving the attackers battered and forcing them to retreat with significant losses. By dawn, Carpiquet still held firm. Throughout the rest of the day, the German artillery pounded the village with mortars and rockets, hoping to break the resolve of the defenders, but the Canadians refused to yield. At first light on July 6th, the faltering defenders made another determined push, this time with tanks rolled forward alongside SS infantry. Though the initial thrust forced the Canadians to pull back momentarily, when Sherman tanks joined the fight, with the combined strength of infantry and armor, the Canadians counterattacked, driving the Germans back and restoring the defensive line. Now, all the Canadians had to do was wait. Operation Charnwood. The final chapter of the Battle for Carpiquet Airfield unfolded a few days later, when, in Operation Charnwood on July 9th, a massive bombardment by 450 Royal Air Force bombers softened the German defenses, paving the way for a coordinated ground assault. As the remaining German positions, including the southern hangars, fell swiftly under the Canadian advance, smoke still lingered over the runways, and the wreckage of tanks and planes littered the landscape. At last, the aerodrome had entirely fallen into Allied hands, its capture marking a turning point in the campaign. Many critics believed Operation Windsor fell short of its ultimate goal, forcing the Allies to launch the more extensive Operation Charnwood days later to complete the task. Another criticism came with the high cost in Canadian lives. Over 400 casualties and the destruction of 13 tanks led many to question whether the operation's partial gains justified its heavy toll. Despite its setbacks, Operation Windsor established a vital foothold at Carpiquet, bringing the Allies closer to Caen than any previous assault. Despite it all, while the airfield and its surroundings had become an inferno, the 8th Brigade held on for 4 days. As Major J.E. Anderson of the North Shores told his men, quote, "I'm sure that at some time during the attack, every man felt he could not go on, and the advance seemed pointless as well as hopeless. I never realized, until the attack on Carpiquet, how far discipline, pride of unit, and above all pride in oneself and family can carry a man."